Around the World Lit Audio 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel García Márquez. Chapter 7. Full Narration Script. Channel Intro. Welcome to Around the World Lit Audio, the greatest novels ever written, from every corner of the world, in English. New chapter every week, free to listen. Chapter Recap. In Chapter 6, the war came to Macondo. Aureliano watched the election ballots being falsified, lost his young wife Remedios, sat in his workshop for 3 days, and came out Colonel Aureliano Buendía. He gathered 8 men and left Macondo without looking back. Ursula watched him go from the doorway and went inside, and began preparing the evening meal. Chapter 7. Chapter 7. José Arcadio Buendía died under the chestnut tree. He had been under it for a long time, years, in fact, since the madness had fully taken him, and the family had, with the particular practicality of people who must accommodate the unaccommodatable, tied him to the trunk with a rope long enough to allow him some movement but short enough to prevent him from causing the kind of trouble that a brilliant, deranged man with unfettered access to the village might cause. He had not seemed unhappy under the tree. He had conversations with Melquiades, who had been dead for years and was therefore the ideal interlocutor, since the dead have infinite patience and no competing agenda. He had conversations in Latin, which surprised everyone since no one had taught him Latin, though this was perhaps less surprising than it seemed, since no one had taught him alchemy either, and he had pursued it with considerable competence. He was not alone under the tree. People visited, the children of the village, who found him interesting in the way that children find the genuinely strange more interesting than the merely unusual. Ursula visited him. He rarely recognized her, but she came anyway, with the specific quality of a woman who has decided that presence is its own form of meaning regardless of whether it is received. On the morning he died, the weather changed. It began to rain small yellow flowers. Not metaphorically, literally, small yellow flowers, falling from the sky over Macondo, settling on the roofs and the streets, and the garden of the Buendía house, covering José Arcadio Buendía, where he sat under his chestnut tree, with a layer of yellow that was quiet, and specific and entirely impossible. The village woke to find itself covered in flowers. Nobody could explain this. The flowers continued to fall all morning, thickening as the hours passed, until the ground was carpeted in yellow and the air smelled of something that had no name in the vocabulary of Macondo, something sweet and ancient and final. José Arcadio Buendía was found under his tree that afternoon, dead, with his eyes open and an expression of clear attention that he had not worn for years. They buried him under the chestnut tree, which seemed appropriate. He had spent so long under it that it had become his place, the place in the world most associated with him, most shaped by his presence, most likely to hold him when nothing else could. Ursula organized the burial with the efficiency she brought to everything. She did not weep, or if she wept she did not do so publicly, which amounted to the same thing in a town where the private and the public were difficult to separate. She stood at the grave and looked at it, with the expression of a woman performing a calculation, not an unsentimental calculation, but a practical one, the kind of calculation that a person makes when they understand that grief is a process with specific requirements, and that those requirements are going to be met whether you intend them or not. The war was doing what wars do. Colonel Aureliano Buendía was somewhere in Colombia, fighting. Reports came back intermittently, victories and defeats and near deaths, and the growing legend of a man who had survived 14 assassination attempts and 73 ambushes, who seemed to exist in a state of charmed impossibility that made the ordinary statistics of warfare not apply to him. Macondo waited. The village had changed with the war, had changed in the way that places change when the young men leave and the structure of normal life is disrupted, and the women who remain must become something that includes what the men were, plus what the women were, plus whatever the combination of the two produces in the specific circumstances of a village in a country at war. Ursula became, in this period, more fully what she had always been, the animating principle of the house, the organizing intelligence of a family that was increasingly scattered and increasingly in need of organizing. She managed the household. She managed the finances, which were not straightforward. She managed Rebecca and Amaranta, the 2 daughters, the one who had arrived in a canvas bag with her parents' bones, and the one who had been born in the house, who had grown into adults with the specific difficulty that 2 women in the same house, with the same man's attention can produce. There was a man. His name was Pietro Crespi. He was Italian, a traveling merchant of mechanical devices, music boxes and automata and the various ingenious objects that the Buendía family had always found compelling. He had come to Macondo to install the pianola that Ursula had ordered as part of the renovation of the house, and he had stayed because of Rebecca, or rather, he had stayed because of the complicated situation that developed between Rebecca and Amaranta, both of whom loved him, though they expressed this love in ways that were diametrically opposite, and equally effective at making his life difficult. Rebecca wanted to marry him. He wanted to marry Rebecca. Ursula, for reasons that had to do with propriety and the proper sequence of things, insisted that Amaranta should be married first, since Amaranta was the daughter of the house and Rebecca was a foundling, and precedence mattered. Amaranta did not want to marry anyone. She wanted Rebecca not to marry Pietro Crespi, which was a different desire and a more powerful one. She was in love with Pietro Crespi, in the specific way that some people love, not with the intention of having, but with the intention of preventing others from having, which is love's darker and more enduring form. She succeeded. She did not succeed by marrying him. She never married anyone. She succeeded by interference, by delay, by the patient accumulation of obstacles, by the particular ingenuity of a woman who has decided on a goal, and has found that the goal requires her to become something she had not previously needed to be. Pietro Crespi, unable to have Rebecca and unable to understand why, became in time a man defined by his inability, thinner, quieter, more meticulous about his mechanical objects, as though precision in small things could compensate for the imprecision of his larger situation. He gave music lessons. He maintained the pianola. He waited for something to change. Rebecca ate dirt again. Not openly. She had stopped doing it openly years ago, had stopped doing it apparently entirely, had seemed to have left behind the strange habit of her arrival along with the canvas bag, and the bones of her parents. But in the period of Pietro Crespi's frustration and her own, she returned to it, quietly, in corners, with the focused need of a person whose body is reaching for something the mind cannot provide. Ursula noticed. She said nothing. She was managing too much to address everything. The house was large. The family was dispersed. The war was ongoing. Her husband was dead under the chestnut tree. Her son was fighting somewhere in the country with 32 armed uprisings, and the beginnings of a legend. She managed. And then Colonel Aureliano Buendía came home. He came without announcement, arrived one morning in Macondo with a small escort, older than when he had left, with the specific quality of a man who has been doing something violent and consequential for a sustained period, and has developed the distance that sustained violence produces. Not coldness, distance. The specific recalibration of a person who has learned to maintain a space between themselves and what they are doing. He embraced his mother. Ursula held him for a long moment, and then looked at his face, and understood something that she did not say aloud, which was that the son she had raised and the man who had come back were not quite the same person, and that the distance between them was not the distance of years but of experience, and that experience of that kind does not undo itself. She fed him. This was what Ursula did when she did not know what else to do, which was her wisdom. She fed people. The act of feeding, of preparing food, and placing it in front of someone and watching them eat it, was her most fundamental form of love, the form that required nothing of the recipient, and expressed everything of the giver. Aureliano ate. He told her about the war in the specific way of a soldier, what happened, in what sequence, with what outcome, without the emotional elaboration that a civilian would expect. The battles were facts. The casualties were facts. The strategy was fact. The feeling about any of it was not something he offered, and she did not ask for it. He stayed for 3 days. Then he left again. He would come back 6 more times, over the course of the war, each time slightly more distant, each time more fully the colonel and less fully her son. Ursula watched this transformation with the patient grief of a woman who understood that it was irreversible, and had decided that irreversible things required accommodation rather than resistance. She accommodated it. She kept the house. She kept the family. She kept Macondo, insofar as one person can keep a village, which is not fully, but more than anyone else would have. Chapter Transition. You have reached the end of Chapter 7 of 100 Years of Solitude, by Gabriel García Márquez. In Chapter 8, the war continues. New people arrive in Macondo. Old ones leave or die. And the pattern that Ursula has begun to perceive, the repeating pattern of the Buendía family, the specific form of solitude, that passes from generation to generation like a physical trait, begins to reveal itself more clearly, in the behavior of the children and the grandchildren, in the way that history does not repeat itself, but rhymes, insistently, in the same family across the same century. Chapter 8 is available next week. Subscribe to Around the World Lit Audio so you never miss a chapter. A new chapter arrives every week.